First question. I know. Okay. This.
أنا بعرف إن وسائل التأثير على الرأي العام الأمريكي عم تعتمد كثير على الاقتصاد وعلى المال. فشو وسائل الضغط تملكها الشعوب الفقيرة مشان تأثر على الرأي العام الأمريكي؟
United States have power. Dictatorship. أنا مظبوط ما انتبهتش في بداية السؤال.
Well, the question is that economics and finance play a big role in affecting policy. What kind of options does the third world have in influencing this kind?
In issues of finance and economics, poor third world countries have about as much power as poor people in the United States. But that's not the only factor that affects policy. It's a very unjust world, might as well face it. Every society, even the most democratic, is under the control of extremely powerful institutions, which in fact are totalitarian private tyrannies. But they are not free of public control. There are in many ways for the public to influence developments. Actually, this case is a particularly interesting one. In the Middle East region, for U.S. policy, Middle East planning and strategy is very heavily influenced by the energy corporations. Not only because they're huge and they're basically part of the state apparatus, they're not private corporations, but also because they have a special interest in the Middle East. So you'd expect that their policies would prevail. Well, one rather interesting fact about the past 25 years is that they have lost. They have been in favor of the international consensus. So if the, Aramco, let's say, had been able to decide U.S. policy, they would have accepted Sadat's offer in 1971, and they would have voted for the UN declaration in 1976, and the thing would have been over. There would have been a two-state settlement, pretty ugly settlement in my opinion, but whatever you think about it, it would have happened 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Well, they lost because there's a balance of forces. There are other strong interests. There's the whole, a large part of advanced industry, high technology industry, depends on the military system. And is closely linked to it, and they have important interests, and their conception of running this region is to do it by force, not by negotiations, and they won. Probably they won in the internal conflict, if you look closely, because of public opinion. I think that was the decisive difference. It was sort of balanced, and in fact, the public arena was overwhelmingly run by strong advocates of Israeli power and violence. A lot of them liberal intellectuals, I should say. The kind of people that's no joke, the people who write in newspapers and journals. Now, those are not people with any great influence, I mean, if policy goes in another direction, they follow it. They're not going to stand out against power. Power goes one way, they're within an inch of it. But in this case, there was a conflict, and their attitude happened to be on one side, and that meant that only one point of view was ever heard. And that enabled, I think that's probably what enabled Kissinger to win out in his struggle against the State Department. It could have gone the other way. So there are lots of interests, and public opinion has an enormous effect, particularly in cases like this. In cases where the whole of the financial and economic system is on one side, it's going to be much harder for public opinion to influence things, although even there it does. One should not underestimate the fact that in any society, I mean even a totalitarian society, and certainly a more free and democratic society, currents of public opinion and public activism and pressures and so on can make a very great difference. The cases I mentioned are illustrations, and there are many others.
Mr. Chomsky, regarding your talk about these opportunities for the Palestinians to garner international support, could you at least give us one example of such opportunities, and then your opinion as to the likelihood of the Palestinian leadership to seize upon these opportunities given its current state?
Opportunities at the present or in the past?
Either president.
Present. Well, you know, if the Palestinian leadership were to come to the United States and say, look, we are what we in fact are, conservative nationalists. We're not revolutionaries, which they never were. We would like to elect our own mayors. You know, we would like to run our own affairs. We don't want foreign armies that you're paying for to come and beat us up and break up our, you know, keep us from traveling where we like and so on and so forth. And besides, we don't think that you ought to be paying billions of dollars. You ought to be giving more subsidies to Israel than you give to any state in the Union. If they were to come with that picture, I think they would have overwhelming support right now. And in fact, that picture is more or less accurate. Well, they've chosen not to do that. It could be done right now.
And the likelihood?
The likelihood? I don't know. The likelihood comes from Palestinian society. I can't judge about that. The likelihood of the effect? I don't know. It wouldn't be easy. You know, I don't want to, again, let me stress, this is only one factor. There are a lot of others. So it would take a lot of work to develop these things. On the other hand, as compared with other causes of this kind, the Palestinian one seems to me a particularly promising one. There have been others that have been much, much harder, where you were really struggling against mainstream U.S. government policy with big power interests behind it. And that was much harder, but it sometimes worked. In this case, I think it wouldn't be that hard.
If you were to look back at your book on the historical trend of Palestinian, Israeli, United States, would you still hold the same conclusion, or would you change the trend in some other direction? To square.
It's the same triangle. I mean, you know, things are, that was 1983, and things are different now than in 1983, so yeah, changed some things. But the story is basically the same. It's a triangular relationship. Israel and the Palestinians are in confrontation in this region, and the United States runs the region. In fact, it runs it much more today than it did 20 years ago. Not because of the Russians, incidentally. That was always an illusion. In fact, it's always been evident from internal U.S. documents that they regarded the Soviet Union as a kind of a marginal element in Middle Eastern affairs. And in fact, that's now officially recognized. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when you didn't make any sense to pretend any longer, the Bush administration officially came out with the statement that in a policy planning document that in the middle, that we have to maintain our intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. Okay, have to maintain them. Now I'm quoting, where the threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. Okay, so in other words, it was lies all of these years, and there's no use persisting with them because the Russians are gone, so now let's tell the truth. The truth is that the threats to our interests were indigenous nationalism. The threats to our interests were quite simple, in fact. The U.S. policy toward the Middle East is based on the principle that the enormous wealth of this region has to flow to U.S. investors and the U.S. Treasury Department and so on, not to the people of the region. Okay, so like not to the people in the slums of Cairo, say. They don't get anything from this wealth. And people in the region sometimes get funny ideas. They don't understand why the wealth of their region has to go to rich people somewhere else. There's a name for that. It's called radical nationalism. Radical nationalism is the funny idea that people have all over the world that they ought to benefit from their own resources. And that has to be beaten out of their heads by force. And that takes violence, not just here. And the relation of Israel and the United States developed in that context. I mean, the British had set up a system. When the British ran this region, they set up a system which was like this. They said they realized that, and during the First World War, Britain realized it didn't have the power to run the region directly by force. And besides, it wasn't cost effective, cost too much. So they decided it should be run by local managers, which they called an Arab facade. And this is secret documents. You don't say things like this in public, but now it's public. So the the oil-producing regions should be run by an Arab facade, but the British would continue to rule behind the veil of, dependencies and this and that, and so call them states and so on. Now, the Arab facade has to be weak and dependent, right? It has to do its job. It has to make sure that the wealth goes to the West. It's allowed to enrich itself. That's part of the third world model. But most of the wealth has to go to the West. Since the Arab facade has to be dependable, it has to be weak, so family dictatorships are the favored choice. But then they have to be protected from all of these strange people who get these funny ideas, the radical nationalists, and that requires local policemen with U.S. and British muscle in reserve in case it's needed. The local policemen in this region have been typically non-Arab. So there's Turkey, Iran under the Shah, Israel, Pakistan, which provided a kind of a Praetorian guard for the Saudi royal family, and so on and so forth. Apparently the idea is that non-Arabs find it easier to kick Arabs in the face than Arabs do. I guess that's the reasoning. Anyway, the local gendarmes are non-Arabs, mostly. And if they can't handle it, the U.S. and Britain step in and do it themselves, the big guys. Well, that's the basic picture, okay? And the relations between the U.S. and Israel grew and developed in that structure. So it remains. But there are other ways of controlling the region, for example, by diplomatic and political settlement, which is what the oil companies themselves always wanted. And the U.S. could easily shift to that.
We will take two more questions.
Professor Chomsky, I highly appreciated your presentation. It was so candid, frank, and with a good scientific analysis.
It's not a good scientific microphone.
I refer to international solidarity. You mentioned that you correctly stressed on the importance of this kind of solidarity. But as you know, the international solidarity gives fruit within 10 to 20 years. It doesn't give fruit within 2 years, 1 or 2 years. And in the United States, the dominant politics is politics of power, politics of people who dominate the big companies and the main source of power. And in this society, your committee, the committee in which you are, the Jewish Committee for Middle East Peace, works very well towards supporting the peace, negotiated peace settlement with justice. But I wonder, I follow up your activities, but I wonder whether you have two committees, one with the 250 prominent, outstanding Jewish scholars and academicians, and one with Mr. Mark Bruzonsky, the secretary, whose task is only to attack Arab regimes, mainly Saudi Arabia. And as you mentioned correctly, that the Middle East is dominated by politics of energy, politics of weapons, etc. And that there is a place, the Palestinians can't themselves follow up the advices of Mr. Bruzonsky. So what could you help us in this sense in America, in such an environment which is dominant in the Middle East and which is dominant locally by the APEC? What could your committee do?
Well, first of all, I happen to be a member of that committee, but it's so marginal in importance that, it's kind of committee that consists of half a dozen people who sign a petition now and then. It's one of those things. It doesn't have any role in anything. It's of whatever use it is, but it's not significant. Much more significant is the fact that if a meeting is called, like for example, a few weeks ago, a meeting was called in Boston without even a speaker. Al Sarraj was there, and he and I spoke at a meeting. We had about 800 people, I guess, who showed up just because they were interested and excited and wanted to hear something about it and so on. That happens all over the place, and there are people organizing and trying to do something about it. And they've had a hard time. A lot of it's our fault. I mean, I have talked about things that are somebody else's fault, but as I said, everybody's got to think about what went wrong. You're quite right in saying that the politics of the region are governed by power, but that's not just the United States. That's also everybody else, down to Honduras. The looks more dramatic in the case of the United States because they have a lot more power, So therefore, U.S. power makes a much bigger difference than, Honduran power. But that's the way states work. It's by no means insuperable. Let me say again, in this particular region, it's a rather dramatic fact that the major centers of private power are against state policy and in favor of a political settlement and have been for 30 years, and they have lost. Okay? That's just one of many indications of what I think is true, that this is one that would have been easy to win as compared with others that are much harder to win. As for it taking 20 or 30 years, well, sometimes, but not always. There have been very big changes in the United States in the past 30 years. It sort of began in the 1960s, and it's sort of developed since. And one effect is a much warmer reception to solidarity movements. So take, say, Central America, which the movement developed almost overnight. Didn't take 20 years. The Reagan administration made some threats, really, indications that it might want to move to military intervention in Central America, very much the way John F. Kennedy had done in Indochina 20 years earlier. In fact, they followed that script almost exactly. Kennedy got away with it. The U.S. started bombing South Vietnam. It used napalm, destroyed crops, sent hundreds of thousands of troops later, and so on. There was never any protest. It took years and years before you could build up the most minimal protest over this. In this case, what you said is correct. On the other hand, when the Reagan administration tried to do the same thing in Central America, which is a much more direct U.S. interest in Indochina. I mean, in the United States, most people don't even know where France is. I mean, nobody knew where Indochina was, maybe on the moon or something. But Central America, they sort of know it's kind of right over the border. This is a much bigger interest. On the other hand, as soon as the Reagan administration made its first moves, there was a completely unanticipated popular protest all over the country. The place started going up in turmoil, and they backed off. And a very substantial solidarity movement developed. I mean, I won't talk about it because it's late, but it had no counterpart in the history of imperialism, in my opinion. And it developed very fast and very deeply rooted in American society. It wasn't, a lot of it was very mainstream. A lot of it came out of the churches, middle class, middle American society, conservative circles and so on. Very strong, very committed, very dedicated, and it came very quickly. Things can happen very fast when the circumstances are there, and it's never too soon. It's never too late to start.
Okay, the last question. Okay.
Yesterday you mentioned that you have experience with the Zionist
In the
Zion.
yeah. Well, remember, I was talking about pre-state Zionism, the Zionist movement pre-1948. It had many different elements, and it's interesting that some of them are kind of coming back into, they're coming to the surface again, partly as a result of what a lot of Israelis understand to be the injustice and oppression of the Oslo process. The pre-state Zionist movement was not committed to a Jewish state. Maybe that's what the leadership had in mind. In fact, uncertainly, that's what they had in mind. But at least officially, the first declaration of that intention was in December 1942. I mean, I was already a youth activist in the movement at that time. December 1942 was the first official declaration of a commitment to a Jewish state, and that was taken in the United States, in New York. It was later ratified by the Jewish Agency. And then right until 1947, until the state was established in 1948, there continued to be currents which were opposed to it, which were called Zionists, like they were within the Zionist movement. And they were opposed to it on many different grounds, but some grounds were just injustice, that a Jewish state is necessarily a discriminatory, racist state. I mean, if the United States were, the sovereign state of the Christian people in the United States and the rest of the world, I wouldn't be in very good shape, And people understood that and didn't want to support that. Well, that's a tendency. How strong it was, you could argue and debate about, and what maybe it was utopian, maybe it wasn't, and so on. I think it was real. And in fact, it was rooted in socialist ideas, which people may laugh at today, but they didn't laugh at then, and they shouldn't laugh at today either, because they're just as valid now as they were then. And they can be revived. In fact, they're coming back. I was talking mostly about solidarity movements involving the United States, but that's just my personal limitation. That's where I happen to be, so I think about that. But the most important ones are the solidarity movements involving Israel. Just as in South Africa, the most important ones were not the international solidarity movements, but the ones linking opponents of South Africa, of apartheid, within the black and the so-called colored society and within the white society. And the same is true here, and they have to be developed. The roots are there. I mean, like this meeting you attended was a striking example of it. And that can happen and be enormously important. But the crucial point is that it's just, I think it's a fact, I've never seen a counterexample, that in any kind of a struggle for national liberation or anything like it, unless the power of the oppressive societies is eroded from within, it's not going to succeed. That's a pretty simple conclusion from history.
On behalf of Mertv University, and possibly on behalf of also of Water, I want to say how privileged we were to have Professor Chomsky with us. We have had tremendous amount of provocation, inside talks, and I'm sure some of you might agree, some might disagree, but I'm sure he has given us a lot of thought for the future. I want to mention that we are also privileged to have a lot of guests from outside with us. I want to mention 3 guests that I see in the front row who have a lot to say with Palestinian affairs, and I think it was important for them to hear Professor Chomsky. One of them is Azmi Bishar, the other one Professor Musa Bazawi, who has been for many years working with the Palestinian cause. Another one is Mr. Talhami. So I hope we look forward to see you on other occasions as provocative as this one. Thank you very much.
I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.